They say that history is written by the victors, but in the case of Christopher Columbus, history was written by a salesman. We all know the rhyme, the statues, and the holiday, but the true story of the Admiral of the Ocean Sea is not a tale of heroic exploration, but a Gothic horror story of obsession, fanaticism, and blood. It is a story where the shiny veneer of adventure peels away to reveal the rotting wood of a morality corrupted by the desperate thirst for yellow metal. If you look closely at the journals, the letters, and the first-hand accounts of the men who were there, men who watched the world change forever in October 1492, you will not find a brave scientist proving the world was round. You will find a man convinced he was the chosen messenger of the apocalypse, a man who unleashed hell on earth in the name of heaven, and a man whose legacy is etched not just in maps, but in the scars of a hemisphere. Welcome to the dark, unvarnished truth of the enterprise of the Indies. To understand the darkness, you must first understand the desperation. The Europe of the late 15th century was not a place of enlightenment. It was a claustrophobic corner of the world, hemmed in by the Ottoman Empire to the east and the terrifying, endless gray Atlantic to the west. Spices, silk, and gold, the lifeblood of commerce, had to pass through Muslim lands, bleeding Christian coffers dry. Spain was forged in this crucible. In 1492, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand had just completed the Reconquista, driving the Moors from Granada. They were victorious, yes, but they were also broke. Their treasury was empty, their soldiers were restless, and their religious fervor was at a boiling point. Into this court walked Cristoforo Colombo, a Genoese wool weaver turned mariner, a man with white hair before he was 30, possessing a piercing gaze and a silver tongue. He was not a genius geographer. In fact, his math was disastrously wrong. He believed the Earth was significantly smaller than it actually was, and he believed Japan lay roughly where the Virgin Islands are. Had the royal counselors of Salamanca not been overruled by the Queen's gamble, Columbus would have been laughed out of court. But he wasn't selling geography. He was selling gold and God. He promised the monarchs that the wealth he found would fund the recovery of Jerusalem, triggering the second coming of Christ. It was the ultimate pitch. Invest in me, and I will buy you the kingdom of heaven. The voyage itself was an exercise in psychological torture. For 33 days, 3 small wooden ships bobbed on the vast, breathing chest of the Atlantic. The narrative we are taught depicts a brave crew, but the reality was a powder keg. Columbus kept 2 logbooks, a real one for himself and a fake one for the crew that underreported the distance traveled, so they wouldn't realize how far they were from home. By early October, the men were not just afraid, they were murderous. Mutiny was whispered in the dark corners of the Santa Maria. They spoke of throwing the crazy Italian overboard and turning back before the winds trapped them forever in this blue purgatory. Columbus didn't save himself with charisma, he saved himself with a bluff, begging for just 3 more days. History hung on that razor's edge. If the trade winds had faltered, if the clouds had obscured the moon, the ships might have turned back, and the Americas would have remained a ghost story to Europe for another century. But on October 12th, under the light of the moon, a lookout named Rodrigo de Triana saw white sand glowing in the distance. He shouted "Tierra," earning him the promise of a silk doublet and a pension from the monarchs. But he would never see that money.
Columbus founded a new settlement, La Isabela, on a desolate, mosquito-infested coast. It was a disaster of urban planning. The settlers, many of whom were hidalgos, minor nobility, who believed manual labor was beneath them, began to die of dysentery, malaria, and starvation. They had come to pick gold off the ground, not to farm. When the gold didn't appear in the quantities Columbus had promised, the mood turned mutinous. To quiet the critics and pay the investors, Columbus needed a commodity. If he couldn't fill the ships with gold, he would fill them with bodies. In 1495, he launched a massive raid into the interior of Hispaniola. The Spanish cavalry, armored and mounted on horses, beasts the Taino had never seen and believed to be one creature with the rider, ran down the fleeing natives. The war dogs, massive mastiffs trained to kill, tore people to shreds. The carnage was absolute. From the survivors, Columbus picked 500 of the best specimens, loaded them onto ships, and sent them to Seville to be sold as slaves. 200 died on the voyage, their bodies tossed into the Atlantic, a trail of bones marking the route home. But the true horror was the system Columbus installed on Hispaniola to squeeze the land dry. He implemented the tribute system. Every Taino over the age of 14 was required to fill a hawk's bell, a small copper trinket, with gold dust every 3 months. Those who lived in areas without gold had to provide 25 pounds of spun cotton. When a native delivered their tribute, they were given a brass or copper token to wear around their neck. If a Spaniard found a Taino without a token, the punishment was swift and mechanical. They cut off the person's hands and left them to bleed to death while their family watched. It was a regime of terror that defies comprehension. Thousands of natives fled into the mountains, choosing starvation over the tribute. Others committed mass suicide, drinking cassava poison to escape the white demons. Mothers killed their own infants to save them from the Spanish dogs. The population of Hispaniola, which estimates place anywhere between 300,000 and several million in 1492, collapsed. Within 2 decades, the Taino were effectively extinct as a distinct culture. It was one of the most complete genocides in human history, orchestrated not just by disease, but by the cold mathematics of a balance sheet. While the island became a slaughterhouse, Columbus was losing his grip on reality. He was a terrible administrator, paranoid and vindictive. He punished his own men with medieval cruelty. For minor infractions, Spanish settlers were whipped, put in the stocks, or had their tongues cut out for speaking against the admiral. The paradise of the New World had become a hellhole of disease, rebellion, and rotting corpses. The settlers sent secret letters back to Spain, describing Columbus as a tyrant who was concealing the profits for himself. Meanwhile, Columbus's writings began to drift into mystical delirium. During his 3rd voyage, observing the way the North Star moved, he concluded that the Earth was not round like a ball, but pear-shaped, or shaped like a woman's breast, with the nipple representing the location of the Garden of Eden, which he believed he was approaching. He began to sign his name with a cryptic triangular signature, styling himself as the Christ-bearer, the man destined to usher in the end times. He wasn't just exploring anymore. He was on a divine pilgrimage, and the suffering of the heathens was merely collateral damage in a cosmic script. The breaking point came in 1500. The complaints from Hispaniola became too loud for the king and queen to ignore.
Biologically, the Columbian exchange was less an exchange and more a bombardment. Columbus and his men were walking biological weapons. Their bodies were reservoirs of smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus,
diseases that had evolved in the filth of European cities and the close proximity of domesticated animals. The Taino lived in a world without horses, cows, or pigs, and thus had no immunity to these beast-born plagues. When Columbus sneezed, a village died. There are accounts of Spanish friars traveling to baptize natives only to find entire settlements silent, the hammocks filled with the dead, the fires long burnt out. The social fabric of the indigenous societies unraveled. Elders died, taking oral histories and survival knowledge with them. Leaders died, leaving power vacuums that caused civil strife. The Spanish interpreted this mass death not as a tragedy, but as divine providence. God is clearing the land for us, they said. It reinforced their narcissism. Surely, if the very air killed the heathens but left the Christians standing, their cause was just. Ecologically, Columbus waged war on the land itself. The ships brought European livestock, pigs specifically. The Spanish released pigs onto the islands to breed so they would have food for future voyages. These pigs were an ecological catastrophe. They rooted up the delicate tubers the Taino farmed. They ate the eggs of ground-nesting birds. They multiplied without predators. The meticulous agriculture of the Taino, the Conuco mounds that prevented erosion and maximized yield, was trampled by Spanish hooves. The ecosystem that had supported millions could suddenly only support the few who controlled the food supply. Hunger became a weapon. The Spanish controlled the storehouses. If you wanted to eat, you dug for gold. The economic engine, however, was the most deliberate cruelty. We must revisit the mines. The mines of Hispaniola were often just streams where natives were forced to stand in water for days, sifting silt. But the labor soon moved to hard rock mining. The conditions were dantesque. Natives were worked in shifts that lasted for days, driven by overseers with whips. There was no rest, no food breaks, only the relentless demand for production. Las Casas, a priest who later repented and became the protector of the Indians, wrote vividly of this time. He described how men were worked until they dropped, and how their wives, exhausted from forced labor in the fields, could no longer produce milk for their babies. In a short time, Las Casas wrote, 7,000 children died because their mothers' breasts had dried up. The birth rate plummeted to near zero. It was a slow-motion extinction event. And through it all, Columbus remained the CEO of this enterprise. He wrote letters to the monarchs complaining about the laziness of the Indians, arguing that they needed to be disciplined to save their souls. He proposed a transatlantic slave trade to balance the books. He sent 5 ships of slaves to Spain in 1495, explicitly valuing them as goods. He reasoned they are easier to maintain than livestock. When Queen Isabella, who had a complex moral view of the natives as her vassals, ordered some of the slaves returned, Columbus was irritated. He didn't see vassals, he saw currency.
When rescue finally came, after a year of waiting, it was almost an afterthought. The governor of Hispaniola, Ovando, who had replaced Bobadilla, was in no rush to save Columbus. Ovando was busy finishing the job Columbus started. He was ruthlessly suppressing the last of the Taino resistance. By the time Columbus stopped in Santo Domingo on his way home, the island was pacified, meaning it was a graveyard. The gold was flowing, but the silence was deafening. Columbus returned to Spain in 1504. Queen Isabella, his greatest patron, died shortly after. With her death, Columbus's protection evaporated. King Ferdinand respected Columbus's utility, but found him annoying and expensive.
Columbus spent his final 18 months following the royal court from city to city, a ghost at the banquet, demanding the restitution of his titles and his percentage of the profits. He was not poor. He was actually quite wealthy from the gold that did trickle back, but he felt destitute because he had been denied his glory. He wanted the recognition. He wanted his sons to inherit the title of viceroy. He died in a rented house in Valladolid on May 20, 1506. No bishops attended his funeral. The chroniclers of the time barely mentioned his passing. The world had already moved on. Amerigo Vespucci was writing letters describing a new world, a continent that would bear his name, not Columbus's. But the dark ripple effect continued. The gold that Columbus's successors extracted from the Americas had a curse of its own. It flooded the Spanish economy. Because the Spanish elite disdained industry and manufacturing, preferring to buy goods from abroad with their easy gold, Spain didn't develop a domestic economy. They bought guns from Germany, cloth from England, and ships from the Dutch. The gold flowed right through Spain and into the coffers of its enemies. It caused hyperinflation. The cost of bread in Castile skyrocketed, starving the Spanish peasantry. The wealth of the Indies impoverished the common people of Spain while funding endless bloody wars against the Protestants in the north. It was a cycle of misery that began in the mines of Hispaniola and ended